Really excited to be talking through this particular content for today. I've had a lot of questions from folks, especially the past couple of months, about this particular approach for LimaCharlie and ways that it might be beneficial. So I'm excited to bring this to everyone. With that said, I wanted to talk a little bit today. The goal of today's webcast is to talk about integrating LimaCharlie and Microsoft data together. And this is not done for kind of just ridiculous reasons, meaning like, oh, this is just another data feed that you can bring in or some other thing that, you just like add to the kitchen sink, if you will. With that said, I wanted to kind of break out as to why bringing in Microsoft data can actually be a strategic decision for some of you that are out there, number one, and two, how you can actually expand your line of services around them. If you are in a managed service capacity, an MSSP or an MDR or something, and you're looking to bring maybe some additional services to your customers, or you've got a customer who is already requesting, hey, can you monitor my Microsoft data for me or something? This is a good place to start, right? This is a good place to kind of get into it and be like, what can I do with LimaCharlie? How can it help me deliver on that? And this is really good and beneficial for folks who are already in a capacity where they might already be using LimaCharlie. Maybe they've already deployed the EDR or something along those lines. And in that case, they're really like, hey, how can I just kind of take what I'm already using and make it more, right? Expand it or expand the service offerings. So with that said, we're going to cover a few details today about what it might mean, why you might want to bring the data in. And then we're going to get into what an ingestion workflow looks like in LimaCharlie. This is definitely going to be a LimaCharlie specific part right here. And then we're going to get into, I've got three like high level use cases we'll talk about from a business perspective. And then kind of, they tie in from an integration perspective as to how they would work as well. But I want to make sure we cover these. If you're watching the recording of this and you didn't get a chance to ask us any live questions and you have some, which I'm guessing you might, feel free to hit us up in the LimaCharlie community Slack. That's at slack.limacharlie.io. You can join us there and just, kind of fire questions out. But we'll make sure that we've got, as much representation as we can when it comes to the different products that Microsoft has. And last, but certainly not least, is also going to be our documentation. I do know that documentation is kind of an ongoing living thing. And as Microsoft changes their products and offerings, this particular topic will go through frequent changes and version updates as well. So that's why I recommend lean on the community Slack. If you're like, hey, that documentation seems outdated, or that's not the step that I'm used to taking, feel free to hit us up and be like, why is this different? Or like, what's going on here? Because there's certainly reasons for doing all sorts of things. When I say Microsoft data in today's webcast, what I'm really talking about here is not necessarily the endpoint side of things, right? Endpoints from a Windows perspective or from a Windows event log perspective are often easily covered by endpoint strategies. I will note that LimaCharlie can obviously cover these. However, this is going to focus a little bit more on Microsoft Azure and its cloud coverage or cloud footprint. I wanted to make sure that we spend some time focusing on like the cloud side of things. Meaning I'm going to be bringing in Microsoft cloud data. I want to find better ways to operationalize or to work with it. So today is going to focus on the cloud side of things. All right. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm excluding any of these. In fact, one of my use cases does involve an EDR deployment as well. However, I'll just make a note that a lot of the things we talk about today are going to be focused on getting Azure data into LimaCharlie. I'm going to take myself off stage as we go through a couple of these here, because I want to make this discussion point really the focus, which is when I talk about a Microsoft cloud footprint, folks, we're not really talking in the same way that we do with like a third-party application or some other like easily managed thing, right? So if I talk about, we integrate with 1Password, okay? That's a single product or a small suite of products, but it's really like a simple log feed or something that can be brought in. And it's very easy to consume data. When we talk about a Microsoft Azure cloud footprint, we're not talking about a single or a small product. This can be multiple log generating Azure products. And I'm talking, the scale and size of them doesn't matter. Meaning if you have a 10 gigabyte database, or if you have a terabyte SQL database in there, that's not what we're referring to here necessarily. Obviously, one will be busier than the other, but it's more about the number of different products you can have spread out. So I can have a database linked to virtual machines, linked to DNS, linked to webfront, linked to an application, linked to an API gateway. All these different things are built in there. Whereas in other situations, you might just have a web server with web logs. So it's a little bit of a different approach, right? Number one. Two, you might be talking from a Microsoft perspective about a massive Defender deployment. And when we say massive, I'm obviously not referring to 100 or 200. I'm talking tens of thousands of Microsoft Windows Defender deployments that are out there. And you might also be saying, hey, Matt, my Microsoft cloud footprint involves thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of users being represented in Entra ID. The point being, when we think about a cloud footprint, again, it is a vast deployment, multiple products, tens of thousands of systems and users all working together. That's got to become part of the consideration for how we do and why we do what we do. So, Matt, I want to bring in Microsoft data. What is it you want to bring in has got to be an important discussion point, right? Securing the cloud environment or securing a cloud environment is already complex enough. You couple this with every other thing that an enterprise or that a customer might have, and it's really easy to get overwhelmed. And I just coined this morning, over dashboarded or over platformed, where you're just dealing and managing with all these different things. So the first step to anyone wanting to bring this data in is usually going to be consolidation, which is, Matt, we're tired of logging into 17 different things in order to get some perspective here. We want to be able to log into 1, 2 things, as opposed to, I think there was a recent survey done over the summer 2024. Some organizations have 77 different security products and 77 things to log into, and that's too much. So the first step is often consolidation, right? The second step then becomes, what other things do I want to consolidate with? What other data types, what other sources do I want to consolidate with? Things like firewall logs? Do I want to consolidate things with other devices the environment may have? Do I want to consolidate with other applications? And you get to this point where you're kind of like, okay, so if my first use case is really data consolidation, I am really just looking at a platform from a consolidation perspective. I got this question from someone yesterday. Well, if I'm just looking from a consolidation perspective, why not look at some other SIEM or cloud SIEM-based platform? And I would advise and say, absolutely. If you want to be locked into that one, go for it. And when I say locked in, this applies to both enterprise teams and managed security providers and MSSPs and MDRs in particular. If you're going to tether yourself to a vendor-specific SIEM platform, something that is very closely tied to certain specific sets of data, it's not necessarily a bad thing, but I want you to consider what it's going to take to bring in the other stuff. So it's really easy to say, I'm going to look at all this data from all this one platform in all this one thing, and then a customer comes along or a new security stack comes along and says, I want to bring in other non-vendor data. And now we're looking at integrations, and that can be a tough road to go down if you don't have the support that you need. So I usually like to issue that as my first caveat. The second one's obviously going to be cost effectiveness. It's easy to say, oh, look, there's the world's most luxurious kitchen sink. It can hold everything, and I can pipe all the data into it, and it will all just live and be in there, and I can build security processes around it. And then the first monthly bill shows up, and you're like, oh, that's why it was so easy to do, because I'm paying for this in somewhere. But we're not here to talk about costs necessarily. I just want to, include that with LimaCharlie as a central consolidation point, you can bring all of this stuff into one place and still take advantage of the other benefits that are built into the platform as well. So if you are on that managed security side, managed detection side, multi-tenancy, as you know, is built in for us. We're API first. You can white label. We've got lots of folks that do white label a website, extremely granular ACLs for you and your customers and your customers' customers. And then there's also a CI/CD management capability for any number of tenants that you have. That's an important consideration to keep in mind because, again, think about scale here. Managing one environment, one set of data, one set of things, okay, super straightforward, right? However, what if I've got to manage 10, 20, 30 of these different complex puzzles all built in together? It's really difficult to build a service or to offer some sort of reliable service on top of all of those if I don't have things like multi-tenancy upfront. If I don't have ease of tenant management upfront, then it's going to be very difficult for me to actually do this effectively. That is, I think, one of the biggest hurdles or roadblocks that a lot of managed teams out there, I should say teams that manage companies, deal with out there, is they run into this issue of scale. The only way we can solve this is to hire more people, and there's only a set number of people out there. We want to make that easier for you. So in this undertone of integrating with Microsoft is also ways that LimaCharlie makes a lot of these different things easier, and ways that kind of that SecOps cloud platform approach makes life a lot easier. But with that said, I think there's plenty of business reasons that make sense to bring LimaCharlie and Microsoft data in together. Just to quickly recap, I'm not talking about, hey, you should just bring all your Microsoft data in here because LimaCharlie wants all of it. I want you to take that strategic point of view. Why would we bring all this stuff in? What's the goal for me and my organization? Are we looking to design a new service? Are we looking to offer something additional for our new or current customer base? Or are we just looking to streamline the way we're bringing this stuff in because our old mechanism is just too costly or doesn't scale very well? Starting there, as I mentioned earlier, consolidation often becomes the first use case that everyone thinks of. But the other one might be, I can't hire any more people. I need to find ways to bring my infrastructure costs down. That might be, kind of use case one, in which case we can help. Use case two might be, you know what, Matt, I'm really appreciating all of this telemetry that I'm bringing into some other thing, but I'm not able to do anything with it other than view it. Well, we'll talk about that in a little bit, but that's another capability that you might be seeking out. So in that case, it's not the size of the team, it's the expertise of the team that you really want to empower more. Empowering a security team is one of the best steps you can do to grow and mature, and just say, not only can we ingest stuff, we can also action off of it as well. I want to get into talking about the ingestion workflows because this is usually the most important part about bringing Microsoft data in, and the part where a lot of folks get tripped up. And I found very often when I work with a lot of security teams that getting the data into the platform is kind of, one of the most difficult tech parts. When I get the data in, everyone knows what to do. They're like, okay, I'm Matt, I'm a security professional. I'm used to looking through logs or looking through data or finding anomalies and things like that. But getting it into LimaCharlie is the part that, we want to make sure we've got covered and down pat. This should be the least friction, I think, in getting stuff in. And it's often a moving target. I'll talk about why as we go through each one. But in general, when you're bringing in data into LimaCharlie, you've got to know two things. The first is what you're ingesting, and the second is how you are ingesting. Now, I have them listed, what and then how. It could be how and then what. It's not sorted by importance necessarily. However, a lot of times there are cases where the how is the tricky part, and then that also decides the what. So in a lot of times, the how becomes the foundation for what you're bringing in. And I've got a few examples I'll walk through to explain that to you. That's going to be the starting point for bringing really any data point into LimaCharlie, but Microsoft data in particular. Now, since we're on the topic of obviously Microsoft data, I drilled down into 3 distinct ways that data can be brought in. The first one is going to be via the Graph API. I'm going to call this kind of a direct connection, right? We'll talk about this one in just a second here. The second is going to be Azure storage blobs. And then the third is just going to be raw files, which I actually find to be very rare, but my incident response and forensic background will let me forget that it is very possible to sometimes just receive a dump of files, gigabytes, terabytes of files from maybe a customer, some historical archives or something, and you want to ingest and work off of that data. But nonetheless, they're all possible, easy to bring in. We'll walk through the different steps for each. The first thing I want to cover, only because some folks might not be too familiar with this one, is going to be the Graph API. So Microsoft's Graph API is essentially its connection, I should say, as of October 2024, its connection into all of Microsoft's different products. There are certain routes and paths and endpoints within the API itself, but a lot of times if I want to get data out of Azure from an API perspective, it's done via Microsoft Graph. We've got some parsers and adapters and basically connectors built out primarily for things like Entra ID and Microsoft 365 or Office 365, whichever one you want to call it, which actually works off of the Graph API. Full disclosure, I'm actually helping to build one of these out with a little more detail right now. But the Graph API allows us in LimaCharlie to essentially connect directly to the Microsoft cloud and pull down events based on what the API offers. Now, if you remember in the beginning, I mentioned the how can sometimes determine the what. I want to be clear. If I go into Microsoft Azure and I start digging through all of my audit logs and all of the granular details that's in there, each one of those log types or each one of those log collections, each one of those audit log data sets may not be readily available via an API. In fact, a lot of times what we see from an API perspective is going to be some sort of meta telemetry or meta events, if you will. Another term I coined this morning, meta telemetry. I'm not really too sure if that's a term, but whatever, it works. I know you want to think metadata, but just hear me out, okay? So for example, there are cases where I might tap into Microsoft 365, but I'm not pulling down, and I'm not speaking from LimaCharlie perspective. This is from Microsoft API in general. Sometimes when you see API connections between two platforms, the endpoint that is being tapped into isn't actually like the raw audit log of that particular thing. I'll use Entra as an example. We currently have an Entra connector that is set up. It's a direct API connector, and it essentially says, hey, with the right configuration details, I'm going to reach out into Entra, pull events back, and have them represented in LimaCharlie. However, the way that connector works is it taps into Entra's risky detections API. So, in Azure, I've got all of my data, all of my analytics, everything being done, everything being generated. And then inside of Entra itself, there's this identity protection capability. And we've got lots of walkthroughs in our documentation for this one in case you're looking for links and whatnot, but it's there. The API taps into the output from the identity protection capability. So really what happens is when you set up that API connector, you're bringing in alerts that have been generated by a component of Entra. That's one option. Another option might be, and this is currently what's being worked on now, is, you know what? I don't want that alerting mechanism. I don't want those kind of meta events. I want the raw telemetry to be brought in. Cool. Well, that's a different API endpoint that we've got to tap into, we've got to hit. And that API endpoint may or may not be available. In the case of Entra, it is. So we're building out that adapter to include that. But in some other Azure products, you might only have meta-generated events, or you might only have the raw audit logs to bring in, not the kind of generalized security events that come in and whatnot. And I want to insert that distinction just because depending on what the API is bringing in is going to determine how much data you have. So if I go set up a connector to some of these data points, for example, and I don't have a lot of alerts being generated, I'm not going to have a lot of data being generated because the data is actually a meta event being brought in. There's a flip side to this though, and you'll see some screenshots of this in a couple of minutes. The telemetry that you do bring in is much higher fidelity. So you can almost pass them in as like direct detection ingestions, as opposed to something that I've actually got to like go through and write detection and response rules for. If there is a particular Microsoft log type that you're looking to bring in, another way to bring them in is by tapping into an Azure storage blob. Now, before you say, Matt, there's so much blue going on inside of these slides, I'm aware. I'll just make a note and say that Microsoft logos use a lot of blue, and so does LimaCharlie. So it just happened to work out that way. I don't know if they're the same shade of blue or not, but there's definitely a lot of blue in there. However, one way that this works is I'm able to configure inside of Azure to push logs from the various Azure products into a storage blob represented by the 1001 in this case. It's going to act very much like an S3 bucket or a Google Cloud Storage or something else would. It's a storage blob. It's a place to store things. The way that we would set that up from a LimaCharlie perspective is we would simply configure LimaCharlie to then tap into that storage blob and bring those logs in. Now, this is where we get into the how versus the what that we're bringing in. The how in this case would be a storage blob. So the way to configure this ingestion would be I'm bringing data in via a storage blob. The second part of that question would be, what type of data are you bringing in? I'm bringing in Microsoft Entra ID data via an Azure storage blob. Hence the kind of two pieces of that connection that I talked about a little bit earlier. Again, I've got a use case to walk through in just a couple of minutes here, but understanding the how versus the what is critical, because that's going to allow you to determine and say, I want to ingest this type of data. I want to bring it in via a storage blob. LimaCharlie helped me kind of parse this thing out. I've got some customers right now who bring in a ton of Azure data to monitor for their own customers. And they are essentially saying, I want Azure Key Vault logs. I want SQL Server logs. I want Defender logs. I want Entra ID logs. And they're bringing everything in via a storage blob. So the storage blob is the vehicle. The passengers are the different data types. When you create that data ingestion mechanism for LimaCharlie, you're going to specify both. I'm bringing in data via a storage blob, and it is going to be SQL Server data. We take care of the parsing and everything and the normalization on the back end. The third ingestion type is going to be via raw files. I'm not spending too much time on this one because it is extremely rare to run into this. However, I have been in situations before, and it is possible in Azure to just directly export logs to disk as well. I've been in plenty of situations where this is like the thing that you're dealing with. You're receiving a gigabyte or tons of logs or something like that. And this is an important place to understand that if you have a bunch of historical data, yes, you can bring it in some way, shape, or form. In this case, as long as it's a structured data format of some sort, JSON, XML, CSV, or whatever, you can obviously easily ingest that. I don't spend a lot of time here because it is such a rare use case that I wouldn't expect us to see it. Now, once we've got the data in, now we've got to deal with kind of what we're looking at. There's a big difference between SQL database logs and Entra ID alerts, Defender telemetry, and things like that. So I wanted to show a few screenshots of kind of what that looks like and what you can expect to see. So in this case right here, this slide and the next one are going to be kind of those meta telemetry or meta alerts, or I should just say alerts, events that you might bring in, right? So in this case, I've got a screenshot here of some sample Defender telemetry data showing things like initial access and lateral movement. Now, folks, let me be clear. On the endpoint itself, there is not a signal. There is not a kernel instruction. There is not a particular kind of EDR event called lateral movement. There is a network connection that opens from one source to a destination, and that is built out. Calling that thing lateral movement depends on the characteristics of that particular connection. So when you see something like, oh, that's lateral movement, there's a whole lot of decision making that's going behind the scenes to say, that is a RDP connection from one system to another. RDP is typically used for lateral movement, and things like lateral movement, initial access, and whatnot are things that we can point back to the MITRE ATT&CK framework, right? So that's going to be an example of a meta event that you would bring in. Here's another one. This is more Defender data that is, again, showing kind of meta alerts, right? Advanced hunting alert evidence, alert info. These are alerts that come directly out of Windows Defender or Microsoft Defender, whichever one it's being called today, pulled directly out of Azure. In this case, the previous two slides, you're looking at alerts that have been generated by the platform and are being brought in. Where LimaCharlie lets you expand a little further, and when I said in the very beginning that scale is going to be an important consideration here, this is exactly what I meant. Exactly what I meant. I'm talking about this right here. So in this case, when I bring in Windows Defender data, you've got to think back to our kind of storage ingestion discussion. I'm bringing in logs from Microsoft Azure. Those logs happen to be Defender logs. Well, the cool thing about that is that Defender logs will typically tie back to an endpoint. Here at LimaCharlie, we figured that part out. I'm not going to say we're like unique in that, right? Everybody's figured that part out. But when we see Defender telemetry come in, we actually go a step further and we assign that particular endpoint its own sensor allocation. So I'm in the LimaCharlie UI in the dashboard right here. And you'll notice I've got a Defender feed, which ties back to Azure with an appropriate icon. And then I've got a demo machine, which is an endpoint that has an Azure with a little Windows logo next to it. Folks, let me be clear. That's not an endpoint sensor. That's not an endpoint agent. That is not a LimaCharlie endpoint agent deployed on that system. That is a parsed interpretation of those Defender logs as they come in. But look at what you get as a part of that. You get things like your normal EDR telemetry, such as your system events, processes, network connections, so on and so forth, coupled with those alerts that we saw earlier. advanced hunting, so on and so forth. So what I've got is actually the best of both worlds. We give you a virtual sensor representation saying, hey, you sent me a bunch of Windows Defender data. I recognize what that data looks like, and I'm able to split that up endpoint by endpoint for you. So you get a representation of each machine that comes in via Defender, even though you don't have an actual endpoint sensor on there. And then we also commingle the other events from that particular endpoint. So you get this really cool meta view of system events as well as alerts being generated by Defender. And what I love about this, how is this a little bit different, Matt, from just deploying EDR? Well, Azure log data, everyone, is brought in per gigabyte, not per endpoint. So this particular setup right here, the only thing that you're actually kind of paying for is the ingestion of the Azure or the Microsoft Defender data. You still get kind of granular agent-based representation, but you're not paying those separate EDR fees from a LimaCharlie perspective. So from a business and service offering perspective, you still get system by system representation. Now, again, it's not a full EDR sensor, meaning you don't have the ability to go in and get interactive with the system, not necessarily, but you do get a sensor by sensor representation. And that's, I think, a pretty cool way to say, send me your Defender fleet and I will happily be able to manage it from a granular way for you. It's actually our first use case as well. The first use case that I've got drawn up here is, again, managing an entire Defender fleet for your customers. Using the approach that we just described, you could easily reach out to a customer, or for your own enterprise, if you're on an enterprise SOC, you can bring that Defender data in and simply just manage it. Boom. I'm going to manage an entire fleet from within LimaCharlie, integrating those Defender logs, and then utilizing LimaCharlie to get that system by system kind of granular visibility if I need to. This may be coupled with other telemetry. I didn't include that in this use case, but it's certainly possible out there. Where we can expand upon this one a little bit is with LimaCharlie's Cloud CLI connector, or the Cloud CLI extension that we have, which would actually allow me to reach back and send commands to the Azure tenant if we need to. That's probably going to be either a follow-up presentation or something from a documentation perspective if you're hearing that for the first time. But we have covered our Cloud CLI connector and how to use it. I definitely recommend checking that out because it can allow you to reach back to Azure and issue commands if you need to. The second use case I brought up, one that is actually a little more common, especially across a lot of our managed security providers here at LimaCharlie, is going to be just monitoring your customer Azure environments. I grabbed a quick screenshot from somewhere online of a bunch of different Azure logos because I really don't care what the products that you want to bring in are. But a really easy way is to say, hey, I've got customers who utilize the heck out of Microsoft Azure. They want me to offer security services on top of what they're doing. I can easily do that. Send all that data into an Azure storage blob and have LimaCharlie tap in and bring that data out for you. Really, really simple use case where, again, you're not having to go through all the different configuration options of managing all these different things. Send it into a storage blob, bring it into LC, and then manage it from LC. Obviously, if logging changes on one side, that would be a little bit different. But in this case right here, it's super easy to just bring them in. Last but not least, the only other use case I've got here, this one I won't go into too much from a discussion point and from a timing perspective as well, but this is where you could actually utilize Defender plus LimaCharlie's EDR. If you were looking for kind of that additional hands-on capability where you were like, hey, I actually do want to get live on the box from a containment or triage perspective, for MDR providers, this is a huge win because you can get a low-cost endpoint from LimaCharlie, use Defender as kind of your low-hanging fruit, AV detection, basic EDR detection and whatnot, and use LimaCharlie as your response. In a lot of cases, when we talk about endpoint tools running side by side, we're talking about two platforms, two logging mechanisms, two entry points, two dashboards, two all of the things. In this case, no, we're talking about one. Because as we've seen earlier, we know we can integrate Defender data within LimaCharlie, back that up against an EDR sensor, and now I've got the best of really, both, or best of three worlds kind of combined in together. And I can manage and monitor my systems all from within one place without ever having to create or set up into a different dashboard for a product that I might not be familiar with. With that said, we're a little bit over on time, and I looked at this as like a way to kind of start to think and talk about some of the different business use cases that you could use to bring LimaCharlie and Microsoft data together. I'm going to be releasing some blog posts around this particular topic, only to give folks something with some posterity. I want to talk a little bit more about Microsoft detection and response rules, like ways that you could take some of the different data that we talked about, especially in this use case right here, and what a detection and response rule might look like against that raw telemetry set. But with that said, it's been great having everyone here today. Thank you so much for joining me. We'll keep it to the kind of allocated 30-minute window, so that way folks have a chance to get back to their afternoons. But if you do have any questions about any of this content, or if there's anything I can kind of drill into deeper, please hit me up in the socials, in the LimaCharlie community Slack, or wherever it makes sense for you to get a hold of me. And we'll happily go through and answer and take a look at what it's like to build these out. With that said, have a wonderful rest of your October, and I'll see you all again on, I'm sure, another LimaCharlie webinar in the future, if I don't see you at a conference or an event before then. All right, take care. Thanks, everyone.